Fantastic. So welcome everyone again to the Summer of Law program. Our session today is what is international law? The Summer of Law program is organized by Kent Law School at the University of Kent. I'm just gonna share my screen just to make sure that everyone is there with us. My name is Luis Eslava. I'm a reader in international law at Kent Law School, where I also co-direct the Center for Critical International Law. I teach international law in the undergraduate program, our master's program, and I have the fortune to supervise several students who are part of our doctoral program and who research on international law. I am also a senior fellow at Melbourne Law School, and I have been contributing to the teaching done by the Institute for Global Law and Policy at Harvard Law School for many years.
My name is Rose Parfitt. I'm a senior lecturer at Kent Law School. I teach also on the international law program. So the courses I teach are Principles and Sources, which is the kind of foundational course, as well as International Humanitarian Law, which is a course about the norms and institutions that regulate the violence, basically, the use of force in international law, along with a wonderful team of colleagues. Before that, I trained at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. I taught for 2 years at the American University in Cairo, in Egypt, just after the revolution. And then I spent a few years in Melbourne working on a project about international law and the history of fascism, the past and present of the far right. And like Luis, I also teach at Harvard Law School's workshop program, the Institute for Global Law and Policy.
So today what we will do is to discuss the big question about what is international law. But as anyone will guess, answering the question of what is international law is pretty tricky and it will take a long time. And here we only have a little bit less than an hour. So what we have decided is to concentrate on 3 sub-questions that in an interactive manner will help us to get a sense of what is international law and how international law relates to realities that are very important for us across the planet. And the 3 questions that we want to explore with you are the following. First, through a class exercise or through our online virtual class exercise, we will explore the question of how does international law relate to the current global crisis. And what we have here in mind is the COVID-19 crisis, but more broadly, all the other global issues that have come to dominate the headlines in recent months. The second question that we will explore with you is how does international law see the world? What is that particular way that international law approaches, uses its framework of reference when it thinks about peoples and collectivities in the world? And the third and final question is using one topic of international law, we want to see what it can tell us about one aspect of the crisis or the crisis that we are facing at the moment. And in particular, the aspect that we want to explore here is the Black Lives Matter movement. So let's start with the first part of our seminar. How does international law relate to the current global crisis?
Okay, so this is going to be a class exercise. I'm just going to share my screen now. Here we go. Hopefully you can all see that. And so I want you to be thinking about this question: what is international law and how does it relate to this stuff, basically? And I'm going to ask you to put your responses to this, any responses you like, in the chat, and we're going to collect them up at the end and put them on the table, as it were. So the chat is anonymous, by the way, so don't worry about any of that. Don't worry if you feel you've got absolutely no idea what international law is or what on earth it could have to do with what we're going through now. Just chuck it in there and we'll talk about it, because I bet you know more than you think. Okay, so we're in the middle of a big mess, and that mess is extremely and undeniably global. That mess is the reason why we're all meeting here on Zoom in the first place. But it's also it's not a secret that if it's a series of global crises, then it's going to possibly have something to do with international law. The question is what? So the most obvious element of this is the pandemic itself. Here you can see a picture of a mass grave for unclaimed bodies, basically in an island just off Manhattan, one of the richest points on the entire surface of the earth, and yet this is still happening even there. That tells you something about the level of the global crisis that the pandemic itself has caused for public health. Then there's the question of the there's the question of the pre-existing mess of conflicts that has been convulsing basically a large portion of the globe, in particular in the Middle East. The pandemic has now come along and made even worse. So here's a picture from the ongoing and absolutely appalling civil war in Yemen that just shows no sign of coming to an end. Yemen's already completely traumatized healthcare system is now dealing with the pandemic on top of that. Then there's also the question of domestic violence, people being under lockdown, locked up possibly with partners who abuse them systematically with no way of getting out. That's been a big problem for many women, but not only for women, also for men, also in some cases, also for trans people, also in some cases. So that's another element of the crisis. There's the environmental crisis, which some are feeling optimistic about because people are flying much less, but others are worrying about because of, for example, the way in which the lockdown and the pandemic in Brazil has accelerated deforestation in the Amazon, for example. This is a protest in Sweden where protesters have put their shoes instead of their bodies in order to, with respect to the transmission of the virus. And then, of course, there is the problem of the massive problem of material inequality, inequalities of wealth and power, and indeed the distribution of pleasure. These, as we know, are taking very pre-identifiable patterns, right? We're talking here about structural injustices organized around race, organized around caste, organized around gender. And possibly the most iconic response to this, the most powerful response to this, has been the way in which the Black Lives Matter movement has gained power and anger triggered by the death of George Floyd at the hands of white police officers in the United States. But this is actually a photograph from Australia. The Black Lives Matter movement has become a real global movement and has taken many dimensions, and many of you have probably been involved in that yourselves. So with all that as your context, what kind of things do you think, what is popping into your mind in response to these questions of what is international law and what on earth does it have to do with any of these crises? We're talking here about public health, material inequality, domestic violence, environmental meltdown, structural injustice, and general conflict. What is international law and what does it have to do with any of these interlocking global crises? So, Luis, can you see anything in the chat?
Yeah, definitely. People are leaving us their comments. So, for example, we have someone has mentioned that international law relates to the current crisis because it impacts the trade, the movement of medicines and key products to countries.
Fantastic.
We also have here another comment, fantastic. The comment is about how international law creates unity, brings peoples together, and also it starts and triggers, empowers social movements.
Fantastic. Unity triggers and empowers. That's very interesting. I wonder if that
empowers
person, whoever they are, they can even put in the chat a bit more about how it might do that. Fantastic. Thank you.
So then there's a fantastic point here that international law deals with current and past injustices.
Fantastic. Again, I wonder how it might do that. Fantastic. Okay.
And a related point to that is a very, very important point about how international law rules is this set of rules that should apply globally. So it offers a normative way of understanding global relations. Then we have here another one about that international law is a very good definition. Rules are the sets of rules and regulations that governs countries on the global stage.
Fantastic.
And then it is another one here that international law has to do with ethics and issues of equality.
Fantastic. Obviously relevant to the Black.
It's a fantastic way of encapsulating what international law does. The comment is international law impacts the relationships, the global relationship between countries through different systems of governance and different strategies, which benefits and detracts from countries, and perhaps it contributes to processes of polarization. So we can start seeing here a critical view of maybe what international law does in the world.
So, international law impacts the relationships between countries through different systems of government. What was the next part of it? Sorry.
Is a set of rules and norms that governs the relationship between states, and it can help to polarize them as well.
Might be as likely to polarize. If I as likely to polarize as to bring together, would that summarize it?
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of summarizing it. And then we have a very interesting point here, and it's interesting because international law normally is understood in terms of public relations, but we have here a comment that international law also has to do something with the regulation of private actors.
Wow, okay, fantastic. Private actors such as companies?
The mention here is very specific, is about, for example, actors including FIFA.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. Marvelous.
So it has to do with public as well as private relations. And then we have here a final comment, again, moving a little bit away from public relations, and the comment is that international law can prevent downturns in the economy.
Can't or can?
Can.
Can. Nice. Fantastic. Right. This is a really great set of issues. That's it for the moment?
I think that's for the moment.
Okay. So everyone continue to put your comments in the chat, and we'll come back to them as often as possible, but if not before then definitely at the end. So what we have here is a fantastic set of responses which really cover a lot of ground in terms of what international law is there to do. So what I'd like to draw your attention to in particular is the way in which we often turn to international law as something that is going to help us solve precisely the kinds of problems that we have just been discussing. For example, by empowering social movements, by dealing with injustice, by being a universal set of rules that apply equally to everyone, that facilitate trade and regulate trade, allowing medicines and other key products to be distributed to those who need them and demand them, except in this case, there's a problem with that. So that is a problem that needs to be fixed in order to allow international law to do its job. It also is not just about countries, which is a normal way of saying it. In international law, we would call them states, nation states, but countries means the same thing. It's about that, but it's also about private actors such as FIFA. We can think about other international organizations such as the WTO. We could also think about private actors like individuals or indeed companies and so on. So often we see international law as something that helped us make the world a better place. So perhaps in this context, we might think, well, if international law was just able to work a bit better, for example, in Yemen, to actually, if we could just convince everybody to actually obey the rules, then things would be much better in Yemen all around, for instance. But we also have this other sort of, particularly in this comment here, I'm not sure if you can see it, I'm going to try spotlighting here, I don't know if that works, about it, that it might polarize as well as bring together, a sense that there's a kind of, there's actually this universality might be imposing itself on different systems of government and contributing perhaps to some conflict there a little bit. So what I'd like to draw your attention to with that one in particular, and just in general as a practice of thinking about international law, is the possibility that international law might be probably is in many ways about providing a solution to these kinds of problems, but the possibility that it might also maybe be contributing to these problems sometimes, or perhaps even causing these problems. And at Kent Law School, we're really keen, so Luis mentioned at the start about thinking in terms of context and thinking critically. That means thinking about this question, is international law necessarily part of the solution, or might it also be part of the problem? Doesn't mean that there's a specific answer to that, but it's a way of thinking about international law. So that being the case, I'm now going to hand over to Luis, who's going to bring some of this discussion together in a kind of a narrative. Okay.
Thank you, Rose. So what we're going to do in the second part of the seminar is to discuss the question of how does international law see the world? And we're going to try to resolve that question in order to understand the particularities of international law's conceptualization of global relations, basically how international lawyers think and approach the world. And we're going to do that in two moments. First, I'm going to tell you a story about how the usual narrative that accompanies answers to the question of what is international law. And then I will try to explore with you what perhaps lies behind, beneath, runs alongside those traditional answers. Our usual way of approaching this kind of approach to international law is to say that there's a mainstream, there's a traditional way of thinking about international law, but there is also a critical way of thinking about it. Okay, so what is the traditional narrative that accompanies answers to the question of what is international law? Normally it starts by the following kind of big point. So when international lawyers or people that are interested in international law think about the world, this planet in which we live, that is very complex and it's very rich in natural endowments, that is very complex in cultural terms. What they tend to see instead of that complexity that I just described very quickly is a world of nation states. And this is because most of all, international lawyers and international law is interested, or what they are interested in a way in which we can solve global problems and attain global ambitions by regulating that relationship between nation states, between states, which international law consider as being equal, at least formally, okay? So the main units that international lawyers use in order to think about the world are nation states. And this has, as we will see in a second, has an enormous value, but also kind of carries with itself a huge number of risks or downfalls. The way in which international law explains the importance of national states is by saying that at some point in history, we took the decision to organize ourselves at the local level in national states. And the starting point for that history is the 17th century in Europe. At that point, Europe had embarked itself into a massive series of wars and contestation on the ground that we now call the wars of religions of the 17th century. And in order to solve those wars and that kind of enormous turmoil and human suffering that accompany the wars of religion, the decision that it was made was that from that point onwards, people from a particular religion couldn't intervene into the decisions taken in another community and the faith that they were following. From that decision and for that arrangement, the idea that we now know as sovereignty emerged. And so sovereignty in this classic understanding means that you have the right, the authority to decide which are the norms and institutions and the beliefs that govern your internal society. And as a result of that, and in connection with that, you don't have a right to intervene and to decide how other people organize themselves, okay? This European way of thinking about how to organize local relations and collective international relations became the framework of reference to think about the world when Europe went outwards in the process of colonizing peripheral societies. So in the process of colonization, in a sort of way, was a process of expanding a European understanding of how to deal with stuff from political matters to economic to social to cultural matters. This story about the expansion of the European order and the European sphere of influence was reorganized severely as a result of the First World War and the Second World War. At that point, the imperial way or the imperial forms and institutions and practices that had come to define how we dealt with stuff in the planet was contested. And the decision was to become a world less imperial, more technocratic, and therefore more international in the sense of leaving behind center-periphery relations that were very direct and forms of domination that were very direct. And the decision was to triangulate our global relations by creating institutions and norms that help us to move away from those imperial relations. In one way that we can explain that is this was a process of technification of global governance. A very kind of material expression of that, and today is seen as a confirmation that international law moving forward at that point in a big way, was the series of institutions that resulted from the Second World War settlement arrangements. At the political level, after the Second World War, we decided that we went to create an institution called the United Nations to organize ourselves politically at the global level. At the level of finances and international development, we created two big international economic institutions and financial institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And at the level of international trade, which is very, very important when we think about global relations, the idea was also to have an institution dealing with that. It was going to be called the International Trade Organization. And we created a body of law that partly is still in place and functional, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. The idea was that these institutions were going to help to organize the world in a much better way, once again leaving behind these kind of imperial undertones of the international order and emphasizing the good bits of what we have learned as a result of the 17th century wars in Europe, and the main lesson, which was the idea of sovereignty. And that, again, unleashed the expansion of sovereignty as such to places that hadn't reached before, because it were under the control of colonial dominations. And this came to trigger what we know today as the process of decolonization, which was the moment roughly between 1955 and 1975 when countries that have been under colonial domination started to acquire their own sovereignty. International law and international lawyers sees that moment, the decolonization moment, as a moment in which international law, the good parts and the most benevolent parts of international law, came to become the mainstream and came to produce this world. And they are secured, the peace is always there, and that bit by bit we move forward into the future. Now, what's behind this story? Okay, what would be a critical way to think about that? Well, the first thing that we could say is that even though this story about a well-organized national state is a very powerful story and definitely has many good things about it, they will supersede this idea that we just organize ourselves in terms of national states. We still live in a world that is very diverse, both in social terms, but also in natural environmental terms. But we also, we need to agree that that expansion of the European legal order to the peripheries of the world as a result of the colonial process was not simply a process of expanding the use of particular legal jurisprudential arrangements of how to deal with our political, economic, and social affairs. It also was entangled in processes of exploitation, okay? And processes of exploitations that were not interrupted necessarily by the emergence of these flashy, very kind of outward-looking international institutions after the Second World War. Those processes of exploitation continue to mark our international economic realities. For example, when you think about the maldistribution of GDP of the gross domestic product across the world. If you look at this graph, for example, United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and Japan continue to be at the forefront of economic power today, when countries that were colonized continue to be right at the bottom. Right here, I have Colombia, Algeria, Venezuela, and Kenya. And these countries not only have very low GDPs, but also their colonial past left them heavily reliable of international trade, and in particular, the acquisition of debt. So these are countries that today perhaps are sovereign, but are sovereign with a massive debt burden on their shoulders, which kind of force us to ask whether that sovereignty as enjoyed by countries that were former colonies offers or have any kind of power, real power in the world. And other problems that accompany this world created by international law is things like the 1%, which is very, I imagine many of you are aware of. So we live in a world today that is extremely unequal, in which the 1% of the population controls the large majority of wealth and resources in the planet. And to finish off, international law and its institutions, yes, are very powerful and very, they have a very helpful outlook on global relations, and they strive to make sure that we move forward. But as we move forward, we have created a planet that is about to implode. So at the moment, we are using 1.5 planets, and if we don't reverse severely our consumption patterns, by 2050, we will be using around 3 planets. So the story that I've been telling you, this critical story about international law, is not just about bad things. International law, of course, is also imbricated. It is a part of the lexicon of grassroots organization and peoples on the ground that use international law in order to contest some of these issues that I have just outlined: issues of economic exploitation, inequality, asymmetries of power, or environmental exploitation. Here I have a photo of La Via Campesina, that is a very important grassroots organization that, by using international law, was achieved in 2018, the passing at the level of the United Nations of the Declaration of the Protection of the Rights of Peasants, which is extremely important when we think in terms of the food sovereignty issues, but also the empowerment of communities that have for a long time been the victims of different forms of exploitation. So with this, we're going to move to a specific issue that will help us to bring back some kind of a much more granular sense of how international law is dealt or relates to some of these global problems.
Thanks very much, Luis. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a quick example of a topic in international law that you're going to find in any international law textbook, and how thinking about that topic critically, which many of your textbooks might not actually do, really helps us make sense of one very, very, very crucial element of what's going on at the moment, and that is, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement. So let me now share my screen again. Okay. Voila. Okay, so before I begin, does anyone have any idea who this guy might be? If you don't worry. If you come from Australia, it's possible that you might do, or indeed Hawaii or the Cook Islands or New Zealand or somewhere like that. But essentially, this is a statue of Captain Cook. Captain James Cook, who died in 1779, a British explorer, navigator, cartographer, and captain in the Royal Navy. This is a statue of him in Melbourne. And he's very, very famous for having, I mean, often he's thought to have discovered Australia. Actually, he was the first person to land in the east coast of what became Australia. And you can see lots of his other voyages discovering places all over the world in this map. Now, by discovery, of course, what that means, even though the word is often still used, is that actually it was discovered by Europeans, because obviously there were a lot of people living there before. So here is a celebration on Australia Day, which happens usually on the 16th of January in Sydney Harbour, a very, very famous opera house and everything. You'll all have seen pictures of Sydney Harbour if you haven't actually been there or lived there. And it's basically a reenactment of the arrival of the first fleet of British settlers, many of them convicts, in what became Sydney Harbour 18 years after Cook's first landing there. But the crucial point to remember here is, of course, that this land didn't belong to the British. It belonged to a people called the Eora, and it still belongs to a people called the Eora, who are still there because it's never been ceded by them. Ceding means in international law being passed by treaty, by an international agreement. So, how on earth did Britain justify its claim to the territory of the Eora and all of the other communities which had inhabited Australia? Now, the rules about this are the rules known as the acquisition of territory. Basically, there are 5 traditional ways in which you could acquire territory under international law. When a river changes course or something explodes, number 1, not so interesting. Number 2, conquest. For example, when one state conquers another, this is the Norman conquest. That's not okay anymore under international law since decolonization in the 1960s, as Luis mentioned, and the rendering illegitimate of European imperialism. Cession by treaty. It used to be the case that states could just cede a little chunk of their territory to another state. For example, the Philippines was ceded by Spain to the US after the Spanish kingdom was defeated in a war in 1898. Discovery, this is the most notorious probably. The discovery by Christopher Columbus of so-called America or the New World in 1492 is perhaps the most famous, but Captain Cook's is also there. Again, what we're talking here is discovery by Europeans. Even then, it was not really enough just to discover a new bit of land. Even then, what you needed to do was occupy it. And this is the point where things get really interesting. In Australia, it was deemed, in order to legitimate occupation, that the country, that the enormous island, the continent really, was occupied by no one. The term in international law is terra nullius. Now, obviously, there were many, many people there. When Captain Cook landed, almost the first thing that happened was that they encountered some of the people who had been living there for indeed up to 60,000 years. And before long, the killing started, essentially. Now, how on earth was it possible? And you can see this map of all, or at least, probably not all of them, but many of the indigenous peoples that lived and in some cases continue to live in Australia prior to European colonization. How on earth could they possibly have thought that this was an uninhabited island? Well, they didn't. It turns out that actually what they thought was that it was an island inhabited by people who had no law. So they didn't count as people for international law. and that meant that their territory could be simply taken by Britain. So this is a picture of Eddie Mabo, a very, very famous activist. There's actually a nice film about this called Mabo, which I recommend very highly, who took, in 1988, took his claim to land and against terra nullius to the Australian High Court, and up to a point he won. It is a huge moment in Australian law, and here you can hear the High Court of Australia explaining how this worked. This is actually how international law legitimated colonialism, especially in settler states like Australia, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, up to a point Latin America as well, all the countries there. So they said when, in this case, British colonies went out to other uninhabited parts of the world and settled there, they're still using this language in 1992, so that the Crown acquired sovereignty recognized by the European family of nations under the notion of terra nullius, i.e. recognized by international law. The view was taken that the law of England became the law of the territory because the indigenous inhabitants of a settled colony had no recognized sovereign. Otherwise, the only legitimate way of acquiring that territory would have been by conquest or cession. The indigenous peoples of a settled colony were thus taken to be without laws, without a sovereign, and primitive in their social organization, i.e. they were invisible to international law. Now, almost all of these doctrines are now illegitimate under international law. You cannot just go out and conquer. One state cannot just go and conquer another state legitimately. You cannot just go and occupy another piece of land legitimately, although of course it does happen illegitimately. Think about Crimea, think about Palestine. You can't just rock up and do it. It becomes illegitimate when you do this. Decolonization and the emergence of a right not to be colonized, the illegitimacy of European colonialism has a lot to do with it. However, the crucial point here is that actually, and this is where we get to the relevance to Black Lives Matter, actually, even though it's no longer legitimate to go off and discover a new bit of land or just occupy it and claim that there's no one there, even though there is someone there, just because they don't behave themselves and organize themselves like you do, that doesn't delegitimate everything that was done on the basis of those norms before. That's the crucial point. This is why in Australia, Black Lives Matter is a huge issue, because it entangled, as it is also in the United States, with Indigenous Lives Matter. Basically, the point is that it was only states that could acquire territory. Any entity that did not look like a state was invisible to international law, just as any individual that did not behave themselves like a European individual was not, for the purposes of law, a person. And so that itself, that's the story of slavery, which obviously is deeply implicated in Black Lives Matter, in the capacity of a white policeman to put his knee on George Floyd's neck, the descendant of slaves, in broad daylight, as though there was nothing to it. Okay, and I could say some more about the Mount Rushmore Memorial in that photograph as well, but I'll leave that for the moment. The point is that international law, just as it can help us get out of domination, has also been deeply implicated in legitimating that domination in the first place, in creating those racialized structures. Okay, so now, having gone through that example, please put your responses in the chat, by the way. And I'm going to now stop sharing my screen and hand back over to Louise.
Thank you, Rose. So I hope everyone has now a sense of what kind of things we could put under the answer of what is international law, both through a mainstream approach and a critical approach. So for the purposes of this seminar, Rose and I thought that we could share with you what is our understanding of international law that brings together these two phases, and an understanding that informs the kind of teaching that we do at Kent Law School in this area. So for us, international law is about the norms and institutions that regulate the relations among states and between states and other entities, for example, humans, non-humans, and the natural environment, as well as the way in which these norms and institutions relate to global realities. So international law is both about norms and institutions related to international relations, as well as the effects that these norms and institutions ended up causing, and the way in which international law ended up being part and parcel of the global order. And here we think about the global order in a broader sense, global order, both things that happens at the international level, but things that happens at the very ground local level. As I was just saying, this understanding of international law informs the way we teach international law at Kent Law School. At Kent Law School, we try to organize our thinking about international law in three key ways, and we want to offer those as a kind of takeaway points from this seminar. We think again about international norms and practice and how they organize global relations in a particular way. We also are interested in international law, like any body of law, should be always understood in context, okay? And finally, and I hope that we hope this was also clear from our conversation here today, how international law is part of the problem as much as part of the solution, okay? At Kent Law School, over the years, we have developed an entire environment of international law subjects that are informed by this approach and by these key points that I just explained. This international law environment goes from the undergraduate level to the master's level, all the way to the PhD program. And the activities that we do and the teachings that we do at all of these levels are accompanied by the program of events and opportunities offered by the Center for Critical International Law. At the undergraduate level, we teach a series of really interesting subjects in international law, including the subject that Roses teaches in the undergraduate program, International Law Principles and Sources, but also we have specialized courses on international humanitarian law, international human rights law in context, international law and global problems, and the subject that I teach, law and international development. And there are many other subjects that are also related to international law. At the LLM level, we have different streams related to international law. We have a stream on international law and international that can be studied alongside international relations. We have a stream on international human rights law, another one on international environmental law. And master's students can also take the option of doing an LLM by research, which means they can take a topic in order to write a dissertation on, and that topic can be on international law. And finally, many of our doctoral students that are part of our PhD program also study international law and have fascinating research agendas on very central issues, some of which we discussed today briefly. So just before we open the floor for questions for the final minutes, Rose and I want to share 3 sources that are freely available on the internet that you can visit if you want to learn more about international law and if you want to be updated about what's going on in international legal studies. So the first of these sources is the UN Audiovisual Library of International Law. It is put together by the United Nations, and it's a collection of small short videos given by an expert in international law on a particular subject. There is also a very interesting blog put together by the European Journal of International Law, which is one of the main journals in this field. They have a newsletter, they are extremely active, and then if you subscribe to the newsletter, you will get an almost daily update on how international law takes on different issues and problems that are relevant for all of us. And finally, we also would like to recommend the 12 review, the Third World Approaches to International Law Review, which is again a journal and a blog. There you can have receive news and interesting articles about how international relate, in particular to countries in the global south, but more broadly to people at the margins of the global legal order. So with that, I want to invite everyone to send us questions on the chat, and then we will try our best to respond them. Rose, I'm wondering if people have started to send us questions.
Yeah, we already have a few questions, which is great. One of them actually is, well, one question we might put on the table. Let me get you a few of them. So one of them is the question, what is the difference between international law and globalization law? There's another one which perhaps we should go to first, which is about the actual course structure itself. I think the question is whether the postgraduate courses are also available on the LLB. So, I mean, Luis, you know more about that. It might be possible to audit, but generally speaking, like the full range is available in both. Well, it's a different program, basically.
Perfect. So should we try to answer some of the questions, the substantive questions?
Yes, perfect. And then I was also going to ask you to explain what TWAIL, so there's a reason called that the TWAIL review is called the TWAIL review, to say something about what TWAIL might stand for. There's also another question, what career areas can international law link to? Do you want to start with one of them?
Fantastic. And there's also a question about what is the difference between international law and globalization law?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
I not put that one in, I meant to, sorry.
So the third world approaches to international law is a movement, and it's a movement that of scholars that are from the Global South or that think together and in relation to the Global South. It started in the 1990s. Today is one established school of international legal thinking, and it brings together scholars interested in questions strictly within the context of public international law, for example, questions about responsibility or international arbitration, as well as questions that are more, I suppose, broader in character in terms of the environment, in terms of social welfare, in terms of international development. It's a really exciting area and a school of thought with international law. In terms of the question about international law and globalization law, what is behind this question is the issue about how international law relates to global studies and the process of globalization more generally. International law indeed has to do something globalization. In a sort of way, international law generated globalization. But when we hear talk about international law, as we try to make clear in our presentation, international law is a particular body of norms and institutions, and that then ended up having an effect in broader global processes. So if you study international law with us, you will learn about these particular norms and institutions, as well as how they are connected to broader issues related to globalization, for example.
Fantastic. So a couple of other questions. One is from before, a bit earlier on, which we could return to now, which is who sets these rules? And another one that's just come up is how can international law be enforced? So I can deal with those questions both together, I think, if that's helpful. So those are excellent questions, basically. In fact, those are the questions of international law. So you got straight to the heart of the matter, because if the point of having a state, a sovereign state, if the thing that's so valuable about a state, the thing that makes, for example, the people of Palestine really want to have a state of their own, the same in Western Sahara, and so on. If the value of that is that the state is sovereign, that means that there's no law above you. How on earth can international law be law, and how on earth can it be enforced? So the short answer is states set the rules. International law, only states have the full capacity to make international law, even though there are other entities, including individuals and non-state actors that have some rights and duties under international law. Only states have the full shebang, basically. There is this problem of enforcement, because if states make the rules, how can they also enforce the rules? In other words, isn't international law a situation of like marking your own homework all the time, right? So there have been several institutional responses to that. The most famous is the United Nations and its Security Council. The Security Council has the capacity to authorize the use of force when there's been a violation, a serious violation of international law in relation to peace and security. But as we all know, thinking about Iraq, thinking about Yemen, thinking about Syria, thinking about Libya, and Afghanistan and many others, this doesn't always work smoothly. So that's just a little taste of it. Then another couple of questions. What do undergraduates learn from international law modules? What career areas can international law link to? And is international law more important for students in the UK because of Brexit? That's a good one.
Thank you for those two questions. They are really, really important. So what undergraduate students learn from international law, I would like to say that they learn two very, very important things. One, they learn about how international law works and what is at the heart of what we also shorthand as the international legal order, which is something very important for everyone that lives in this planet. But secondly, and this is the other kind of level of things that our undergraduate students learn in our programs, is that they learn to think about the world in relation to international law, okay, and international legal history and the development of the international legal order. So at the end of each of our modules, our students are able to say something about the ABC of international law in general, or specific areas of international law, for example, international humanitarian law, as well as being able to see, for example, how international humanitarian law relates to the conduct of war, both in terms of regulating war, but perhaps perpetuating specific or certain forms of violence. This is a very powerful set of tools and skills that you can use later to pursue your studies in international law, but that you can use in order to inform your reading of law in many other areas. Okay, and this is because, as some of the one of the previous questions was already suggesting, we cannot think about law today outside a global frame or without thinking about processes of globalization. We are all in one way or another global subjects today. And I think that relates to the other question about Brexit. The question is international law more important for students in the UK because of Brexit? And I will say, yes, indeed, international law in the UK today is more important than ever. International law help us to understand why Brexit happened, okay, perhaps for broader dissatisfactions with the way European Union tried to control supranational relations, but also international law will help us to chart, hopefully, more productive ways to engage with the European Union and new, more kind of progressive ways of thinking about the international legal order from an UK point of view, but more importantly, from a collective point of view.
And just to add to that, I mean, the Brexit question is always a tricky one. But I think that definitely those in favour of Brexit have been making the argument, and it's a very powerful argument, that if the UK is released from the European Union, it will be able to make its own, it will be sovereign once again in relation to international trade. So then the answer would be, well, yes, because the UK basically needs to get its head around all the rest of the world in terms of international trade. It doesn't have the EU doing that work for it anymore. But then you might also say, and this is what you'll learn if you do the course on development, international economic law and so on, that actually it's a kind of out of the frying pan into the fire kind of thing, because the UK may have released itself from the EU, the treaties that bind the European Union states together in terms of trade and other things, but it's still tied up in numerous other free trade treaties, with often they're bilateral trade treaties with many other states. So it's not really, in that sense, free at all, because all those treaties usually say more or less the same thing. Okay, so there's another question now. This is a great question. Is there a court, basically, if there's an injustice that international law needs to get involved with? Or is there a court, basically? What happens when international law needs to involve itself in some kind of injustice or some kind of crisis? We might say, is there a court, or what needs to happen?
That's an interesting question because it relates to the issue of enforcement, and it tackles the problem, or it speaks directly to the problem that many people allege that international law suffers from, which is that international law doesn't have an army behind it in order to enforce it. Okay, or it seems that there is no a global government there in order to make sure that international norms and institutions have the force that they should in order to solve the problem that they face. And even though that's certain in certain respects that international law doesn't have an army or a platoon of police officers in order to enforce it. There are multiple mechanisms to enforce international law, and that depends on which area of international law we're talking about. So there are different international courts. There are different ways in which individuals as well as collectivities and states can complain at the level of international institutions of the actions of other actors. But most importantly, there's a whole universe, a myriad of mechanisms that we call soft law mechanisms that helps in the enforcement and contribute to the enforcement of international law. So things, for example, in terms of international trade or international economic law. So even though there is no one single global court that overseeing international economic relations, if there is a dispute in international economic law, normally states and actors involved in trade relations can use arbitration tribunals in order to pursue the interests and in order to be heard. And those arbitration tribunals, many of them are ad hoc, or they are called when a specific issue arises. And they are actually very powerful because they can impose extremely massive sanctions and then send a very strong signal to the international community, for example, about a state not being compliant to a particular set of norms and regulations. So again, yes, there is issues with the lack of a unified enforcer in international law, but that doesn't mean that international law doesn't have a teeth in terms of being enforced and practiced.
Yeah, exactly. So there are basically, I mean, the short answer is that there are multiple courts, right? Depending, and they deal with different kinds of issues. So for example, the European Union has the European Court of Human Rights, which is a very rare instance. There are only a couple of others where individuals within the European, who belong to countries within the European Union can bring a case under certain circumstances about a human rights violation. But the main court of international law is called the International Court of Justice, which has very few cases. They're very interesting when they come up, but they're very few. But only a state can bring, only two states, and again under certain circumstances, can take a case to the International Court of Justice. So that means that, for example, non-state actors like Western Sahara, there's a famous Western Sahara case in which two of them, were there two of them? I can't remember. Anyway, but basically the case needed to be brought by states rather than by Western Sahara itself, because Western Sahara is not a state. Then there are dispute settlement mechanisms. For example, at the WTO, I mentioned that earlier without explaining what it was. It is the World Trade Organization, the main institution that regulates international trade. The institution that Luis mentioned earlier, it was supposed to be called the International Trade Organization, and then it's a long and complicated story about why it ended up being the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Yeah, so there's a follow-up question for that if we still have time. I'm not sure whether we need to stop or not, but just I'll carry on until I get a message saying I need to stop. The follow-up question is, what if two countries want to influence another country's rules? What if there are two countries basically, and one is trying to influence, I suppose, the domestic law of another? What happens then? Is the second country entitled to decide its own laws? Again, the short answer to that is yes, right? But then on the other hand, it may be that all states are formally equal under law, but there are multiple ways in which one state can influence another state through pressure that international law doesn't necessarily see. Economic pressure, it will see military pressure, but economic pressure and shaming, like all kinds of other things. Luis, you probably have something to add to that.
I think this is a fantastic question to close because it again invite us to see the importance of thinking about international law in context. So yes, there are very specific norms and rules and regulations that says that today we live in a world of sovereign states, which means as we explained today, that one state cannot intervene in a legitimate way in the affairs of another state. However, if you see any day in the news, you will realize that that's not always comply, and it is not complied because international law exists in a particular context, which is our world, a world characterized by very deep asymmetries, both in terms of economic matters, but also politically, socially, and culturally, which means that even when we think in international law in context, we will realize that it's both about what international law says about itself, but also how it interacts with these realities. On behalf of Kent Law School, I would like to thank everyone that turned up for the seminar today. Please visit, rewatch the previous seminars in the Summer of Law program put together by the Law School. And we invite everyone to apply and to come to study with us. Again, we are an energetic group of international lawyers that try to think about international law in a general, broad way. And we are looking forward to meeting many of you in person soon when the pandemic is over.
Thank you. Yes. And just to add, if you have any further questions that we didn't have time to engage with, please feel free to email either of us or both of us, and either we'll answer your question ourselves or we'll pass it on to another member of the team who might be an expert in that. You can find our email addresses if you just look us up on the Kent Law School website. Really hope to see some of you very soon.